Transition and deconversion language is related to termination language. Often the clause comes shortly after the term and termination section. It's language about what the vendor promises to do to help the customer transition away from its products or services to those of somebody else or something that the customer builds internally. And that often includes transition that happens after termination of the contract or after expiration of the term. So this addresses the concern for the customer that whatever it is the vendor provides is particularly sensitive to the customer's work, that if it were deprived of it relatively suddenly, it would be in big trouble. It would need time to find a replacement. It also addresses a related concern, which is, and this is particularly for software as a service and other cloud services vendors, that the customer's data is on the vendor's system and has probably been manipulated and changed by the vendor system. And it may be in a format that it wouldn't be useful if the customer got it back. It needs to be deconverted. It needs to be converted into a format that's more generally useful. And that's another obligation related to transition that one of these clauses might have. Now, if the contract can't end without a lot of notice, this probably isn't necessary. No matter how sensitive the system is, the customer is going to see termination or end of the term coming long ahead. But most likely, there's various ways the contract could end without notice. So, particularly termination for breach. So the concern is the contract ends relatively suddenly and the customer needs more time than it's got notice to find an alternate solution, or it's really in trouble. This is most likely with cloud services. It makes the most sense. The customer's relying upon this software that the vendor can turn off at any point, but it could apply to any other type of tech contract. It could be professional services that the customer is particularly dependent on. It could be on-premise software that the customer's particularly dependent on. So the clause simply says that after termination, the vendor will continue to provide the product or the service. The rights to the product or the service will continue for some fixed period. And usually it is a fixed period. If you're on the vendor side, you certainly don't want to agree to language that says after termination or end of the term, you're going to keep providing whatever it is until the customer replaces it, because you don't know how long that's going to be. It's usually going to be a fixed period. And it, again, is where it would be very difficult for the customer to move on without the vendor. The obligation isn't necessarily just after termination. Maybe it starts before termination. Maybe the customer has the right to trigger it. The clause says the customer can trigger a transition period, which gives the vendor certain obligations. So it's a awkward thing in a way if you think about it. The contract has ended. Maybe it was terminated for breach, but the vendor is going to continue to provide products and services or allow the customer to use products and services. The vendor is also potentially going to, as I said, deconvert data. In each case, there's no reason the vendor couldn't be charging for those services. It could be worked into the price, but it's also something that vendors sometimes charge for. The issues surrounding transition get really complicated where we're talking about termination for breach. So let's say it's a really mission critical, some kind of mission critical software as a service that the customer just has to have running all the time. So if the relationship breaks down, it needs a replacement before it loses this system. What if the relationship breaks down because the vendor terminates for the customer's breach and the customer doesn't agree that they breached? If you have language that, if the language doesn't require specifically that the vendor provide transition services after termination for breach, the customer's in really big trouble. But this creates a problem for the vendor. You terminated because the customer's in breach. You don't want to be providing further services. And it's particularly concerning where we're talking about, what's the likely breach is your customer's not paying. There's a payment dispute or the customer's just not paying. The last thing you want to do is have an obligation to continue pouring products and services into a hole, providing products and services to a customer you don't think is ever going to pay. I do have a solution for this. There's language in the Tech Contracts Handbook and explained there, and there's, it's also available at techcontracts.com that strikes a balance that solves this problem for each party. So on the customer side, you don't want to have to cure your breach in order to get your transition services. Let's say it's a payment dispute. You don't want to be in a position where you have to pay the vendor to get them to provide transition services, which you desperately need. And then you got to turn around and sue for the money. You want to hold on to the money that you're disputing, that is in dispute and led to the termination. But if you're the vendor, again, you don't want to pour services down a black hole. The clause that I suggest to solve this is a simple requirement that the customer prepay for transition services. Whatever it might be, it all has to be paid up front. And that if the customer does that, the vendor provide those transition services, even if the customer's in breach. That saves the customer from blackmail, and that saves the vendor from pouring more products and services into a deadbeat customer. So it's a nice sort of solution. It is unfortunately not an across the board useful solution. It works really well for the likely dispute, the likely thing that's going to cause you trouble, which is the vendor terminated because the customer wasn't paying. A good solution for that. If the vendor terminated because of an NDA breach or something, because of a type of breach that isn't made, that you just can't allow to continue, like the customer was, posting online the vendor's secret source code or something along those lines, or accessing the system in order to build a competitive product. It's not going to make a lot of sense for the vendor to continue to provide that system. And so this isn't an across the board solution. If you're the vendor and you accept one of these clauses that if they prepay, you've got to provide these transition services, you might want to include exceptions where you don't have to for certain types of breaches, like NDA breaches. So you end up with a relatively balanced solution, but not 100% solution. In general, you're dealing with something complicated, which is that you very well may need, after the relationship has ended or tried to end, the customer still is dependent on the vendor, and you've got to find some way or other to get the customer over that hump, to give the customer the time, whether it's in breach or not, to transition to a new service provider or build a system that can provide the services in-house. If you found this video useful, please come check out Tech Contracts Academy. We provide training on drafting and negotiating contracts about artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other forms of software. It's all for lawyers, contract managers, and any business people involved with contracts. So please come check out our programs live and on demand at techcontracts.com.